10. Execution at the gun range. Marie Moore was a seriously disturbed woman who believed she was the Antichrist. In April of 2009, she took her 20-year-old son Mitchell to a gun range called Shoot Straight in Castleberry, Florida. Mitchell thought it was going to be a fun afternoon filled with memories with his mum doing target practice. But as Mitchell pointed his weapon down the range at the target in front of him, his mother picked up a gun, pressed it against the back of his head and pulled the trigger. She executed her own son in an act of intentional violence. She then backed up, put the gun in her mouth and pulled the trigger. Later on, the police would find a note. In the note, Marie wrote that she was sorry, but that she had to send her son to heaven and then send herself to hell. And in a bizarre audio message she recorded before the incident, she said it was all to save her son from a world of violence. She claimed she heard God's voice telling her that she had a gun and that she needed to use it. The police also learned that Marie had a history of mental illness, that she'd spent time in psychiatric hospitals, and that she suffered hallucinations that caused her to live in a constantly insane state. She often saw herself being eaten alive by ants or burned. 9. Danger in Kentucky. In 2014, a woman was shot and killed near the Knob Creek gun range in Kentucky. The victim was discovered by the owner of the gun range Friday evening near the intersection of Highway 40 and the Dixie Highway. Her name was Danesha Marie McScoots, and she was just 21 years old. The owner of the gun range was Kenny Summer. He was in the middle of closing up for the day when he heard 4 very loud and very distinct gunshots near the entrance of his business. He thought he had a trespasser on his hands, but was shocked when he came across Danesha. She was hardly wearing any clothes. She was crawling along the gravel road, and she had blood pouring out from a gunshot wound. He picked her up and called 911 and immediately drove her to Southwest Hospital. Sadly, the young woman died from her injuries. The police investigation led them to a man named DeAndre McElroy. He'd shot Danesha twice and poured acid on her. She was still alive at the time and had been in terrible agony until she passed away at the hospital. DeAndre was a convicted felon who'd been in some kind of relationship with the victim. Police didn't know if they were dating or if she was selling drugs on his behalf. Whatever the case, DeAndre kept his mouth shut about it. But even with his silence, he was charged with murder and locked up. 8. Georgia Gun Range Massacre. In Granville, Georgia, 2022, the unthinkable happened. A man walked into a gun range and killed 3 people. His name is Jacob Christian Muse, just 21 years old. He's been arrested and charged with the shooting deaths of Thomas Richard Hawk Sr., his 75-year-old wife Evelyn, and their 18-year-old grandson Luke. It all went down on April 8th. Jacob, who lived in the area previously and had actually been a customer at the shooting range, walked in with plans to rob the place. He shot everyone inside the building, took off with 40 guns, and disabled the cameras before he left. But he didn't do a great job covering his tracks. The police still identified him as the shooter, then arrested him at his home in College Park about a week later. In his home, they found the stolen weapons. As for motive, we're not really sure. What the police do know, based on statements given by his roommate, is that Jacob was a bit of an outcast. He didn't have friends, he participated in no groups, and he really just kept to himself. Even so, his roommate said Jacob had never shown any signs of being dangerous or violent. What it looks like is that this loner had wanted a stockpile of weapons for some undetermined cause. He thought the only way to get them was by murdering everyone at the gun range. It's just a good thing police tracked him down before Jacob used those weapons to do something even more vile. 7. Negligent discharge. A man at a gun range in Israel accidentally shot himself while he was hiking up his pants. The video of the bizarre accident first cropped up on LiveLeak, so we don't have all the specifics. We know it happened in 2019 because of the date stamp on the video, and we know it was in the Israeli city of Ramla. The gun range appeared to be part of some kind of training course. There are a lot of men standing in the room with ear protection and weapons. One of the men, a guy wearing a blue shirt and jeans, unholstered his handgun, inserted a magazine, and racked the slide. And then he made a really terrible mistake. The second his handgun was loaded and ready to fire, he reached back with both his hands to lift up his pants. He was wearing baggy jeans, and they were falling down his backside, and hiking them up was a mechanical movement. He probably didn't even think about it. He felt his pants slipping and just reached back to grab them. The issue here was that the shooter had his finger on the trigger when he went to lift up his pants. Rule number 1 of gun safety: never put your finger on the trigger unless you're ready to shoot. As he grasped his trousers, he squeezed that trigger. He sent a bullet into his calf and fell over screaming. He didn't die, thankfully, but it was an incredibly dumb mistake that he probably won't be making again. 6. A girl with an Uzi. There was something that happened in 2014 that really brought gun ranges into the public eye. Perhaps you've heard of this story, but it's worth mentioning here just because of how crazy and unbelievable it is. The tragic accident happened in Arizona. A 9-year-old girl was at a gun range when the instructor put an Uzi into her tiny hands. Yes, an Uzi submachine gun. She grabbed hold of the weapon, the instructor held her back and told her how she needed to handle it, and then she pulled the trigger. But as many of us have seen in the shocking video, the power of the submachine gun was just too much for the little girl. It got away from her, pulled the girl's hand sideways as her finger was still on the trigger, and she fired the Uzi directly into her instructor's face. According to the Mojave County Sheriff's Office, the girl was at Last Stop gun range with her brother and sister and their dad. The instructor was Charles Vacker, and he died from his injuries. Before the little girl had fired the Uzi, it was actually her father who shot the gun off. He was the one who believed it was totally fine for his child to handle such a weapon. Clearly, it was a bad call. As tragic as it is that Charles died instructing the little girl, just imagine being in her shoes. She was only 9 years old when she accidentally committed murder, and she's gonna have to grow up with that knowledge for the rest of her life. 5. An exploding gun. In the winter of 2020, Chris Harmon was with his family at the firing pin gun range in Opelika when a horrible freak accident occurred. He was in the middle of firing his weapon when his gun exploded in his face, causing major injury. The incident happened just after Chris's partner fired off her Taurus 380. She'd fired off 6 rounds and the last one jammed. She removed the clip and got the bullet out, but then it was Chris's turn to fire his weapon. But when he pulled the trigger, he only got 3 shots out before the gun blew up. Chris went down like a sack of potatoes, and he was rushed to the nearest hospital for emergency surgery. He suffered fractures in his left orbital, but his entire eye might have been blown out of his skull if it hadn't been for the safety glasses he was wearing. Nobody knows why the gun exploded. It was just one of those things, and it nearly cost Chris half his face. 4. Shot in the eye. In December of 2016, 24-year-old Sarah Bonner went to the gun range to practice her shooting. Sadly, she was shot in her eye in what was called an unfathomable accident. Sarah had been visiting family and friends in the South Carolina town of Anderson. They decided it'd be fun to go to the Skipjack rifle range. Little did they know, it would be the exact opposite of fun. While shooting at the range, a bullet ended up going straight through Sarah's eyeball and lodging inside her brain. She was whisked to the hospital and put on life support, but died several days later. Even more shocking was that the police couldn't figure out who'd shot the weapon. Nobody knew what had happened, and the deputies were treating the death as accidental. A coroner had to get the bullet out of her brain and hand it over to the authorities so they could match it to whatever gun it had been fired out of. But even after that, there was still no consensus as to who fired the bullet that killed Sarah. None of her friends or family could recall what happened. All they said was that they were shooting their rifles and one of the bullets, perhaps from a ricochet, shot straight into Sarah's brain. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't from being unsafe. It was just a totally random and unbelievably unlucky incident. 3. Incendiary rounds gone wrong. In late November of 2018, at a gun range in Brazil, a group of officers blew the place to smithereens. 2 officers were preparing to test out their new Dragon's Breath ammunition in their 12-gauge shotguns. These officers were training for the Civil Guard, and they were excited to see what kind of damage their new incendiary shotgun rounds could do. Both men fired 3 rounds off at the gun range, but the rounds were way more explosive than they'd anticipated. The whole range went up in flames. The officers scrambled out of the room, which had filled with smoke and fire. The entire range burned down to the ground. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. However, it may not have been the incendiary rounds that caused such devastation. It could have been the gunpowder buildup inside the range. Because the Brazilian cops weren't used to using incendiary rounds, they didn't realize the explosion would light up all that gunpowder residue. It was basically like throwing a grenade onto a pile of matches. 2. Accidental headshot. In 2021, a man in Ohio accidentally shot himself in the face at a gun range. The incident happened at 6:30 p.m. on a Wednesday in Geauga County, about 30 miles 48 kilometers from Cleveland. The man who shot himself hasn't been identified for privacy reasons. He's likely very embarrassed, but we do know what happened. According to the local sheriff's office, the man was shooting off a 9mm automatic pistol. As he was firing, an ejected shell went down the back of his shirt. If you've ever touched a hot metal casing, you'll know that stuff burns. Smoking hot brass rolled down his back, and he instinctively moved his one hand to slap it away. But as he did, he moved his gun too, pointing it directly at his face. He accidentally pulled the trigger as he tried to get the hot brass away from him, and a bullet ripped through his cheek and exploded out the other side of his face. Thankfully, he survived. He didn't hit anything important, but definitely mangled his face and changed his appearance for the rest of his life. 1. Stapler accident. A stapler accident at a gun range in New Jersey cost the local taxpayers over $2 million. Yep, a single stapler was the source of a very large bill. It started with a man named Christopher Onesti, a former New Jersey cop. He's collecting a police disability pension for the rest of his life, all because he stapled the finger of his hand, and the authorities ruled him unable to handle a weapon or perform his duties as a transit cop. Now, as a retiree, he has all the time in the world and still cashes in $46,000 a year. The accident goes back to 2006. Christopher was at a gun range doing his required firearms test when the wind blew his target down. When he tried to reattach the target with a staple gun, he pierced his left ring finger. After he applied a band-aid to the tiny wound, no bigger than a pinprick, he finished the qualifying test. The next day, he reported the injury to his superiors. He was given a rather questionable diagnosis. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that he had 2 surgeries, and 18 months later, he was retired at the age of 29. Thanks for watching. Would you rather accidentally shoot your friend in the butt at a gun range, or crash your boss's car and lose your job? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.